In the autumn of 1851, a distinguished plantation mistress in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, was quietly arrested after the bodies of 17 enslaved people were discovered in unmarked graves behind her rose garden, each showing signs of systematic medical experimentation. Madame Delphine Lalaury's name was already notorious, but this was someone else entirely. Someone who had learned from Lalaury's mistakes, who kept meticulous records, who operated with the full protection of prominent physicians who cited her work in their private correspondence. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield Cross, and she had been conducting what she called anatomical studies of racial deficiency for nearly a decade. With the full knowledge of at least 3 parish doctors and a state legislator, the enslaved people on her property called her the Mercy Lady because she always smiled when she selected them. She chose the young ones mostly, between 12 and 25, those with no children yet, those whose disappearance could be explained by illness or escape. The horror of Eleanor Cross wasn't in the brutality alone, but in the respectable scientific language she used to justify it, and in how many people knew and did nothing. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Whitfield Cross and the medical atrocities committed on her Louisiana plantation, before we delve into the journals that documented each victim with clinical detachment, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications for more true stories history tried to erase. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Bellefontaine sat 3 miles inland from the Louisiana bayou, its white columns rising from the sugar fields like a mirage of gentility. The road to it wound through cypress groves draped in moss, where the air hung so thick it seemed to shimmer. Travelers often paused at the sight of the mansion, a vast, pale structure with wraparound verandas, green shutters, and a roofline sharp as a blade against the horizon. It had the symmetry of wealth, every window placed with intention, every hedge trimmed into submission. Yet to those who lived beneath it, the house carried another symmetry entirely, the rhythm of footsteps pacing through the halls at night, the echo of commands spoken softly but obeyed instantly, and the low hum of dread that grew each summer when the cane rose high enough to hide screams. Inside, the air was cooler, scented faintly with lye and roses. The marble floors reflected candlelight like water. Portraits of the Duval family painted in Charleston and shipped upriver stared down from the walls with lifeless composure. Each face shared the same long, elegant features and the same thin-lipped smile that gave no warmth. Visitors remarked on the silence, how the house seemed to swallow sound rather than carry it. Even laughter, on the rare occasions it occurred, ended quickly, as if embarrassed by itself. Servants moved through the corridors barefoot, their steps softened by years of training. They knew which doors to avoid after dusk. The East Wing, always kept locked, was said to house the ladies' private rooms, a phrase that meant different things depending on who whispered it. Some said she studied medicine there. Others claimed she studied people. They spoke of the faint smell of chemicals that lingered in the air near the stairwell, a smell that mixed uneasily with lavender oil and candle wax. In daylight, the estate functioned with mechanical precision. Overseers barked orders in the fields. Horses clopped along the gravel drives. Clarissa Duval's presence was everywhere, though she was rarely seen. Her routines were followed by rote. Tea at 4, prayers at 6, the ledger balanced by candlelight before bed. When she did appear, the house seemed to stiffen around her. Even the servants stood taller, as if gravity itself adjusted to her favor. They called her Madame Clarissa, never mistress. The distinction mattered to her, though none dared ask why. At night, when the plantation lights went dark and the chorus of insects filled the humid air, something changed in the rhythm of the house. Servants claimed to hear dragging sounds beneath the floorboards, a heavy scraping that came and went without pattern. Sometimes, a single candle burned in the east wing, long after the rest of the house had gone silent. A few swore they saw figures moving past the windows, not silhouettes, but shapes stooped and trembling, as though carrying unseen weight. When asked about it the next morning, Clarissa smiled faintly and said, "We keep late hours here." Those who worked in the kitchen told stories about the wells, how one near the orchard had been sealed with iron plates, how another, near the servants' quarters, carried an echo deeper than it should. A field hand once lowered a stone into it and counted to 20 before hearing the splash. He never spoke again of what he saw reflected in the water before it vanished. Still, the cane was harvested, the accounts balanced, and the plantation thrived. On ledgers and maps, Bellefontaine appeared as a success story, a jewel of the Louisiana frontier. But beneath its roots, beneath the polished veneer of civility and scripture, something older was rotting. And every humid evening, as the oak branches swayed and their shadows stretched across the veranda, the house seemed to breathe. Those who slept under its roof learned not to listen too closely. Clarissa Beaumont Duval was born into privilege and precision. Her father, a Charleston merchant, dealt in cotton, tobacco, and the lives of the people who harvested both. From a young age, she was taught that refinement was proof of divine favor, that grace, posture, and intellect were not learned but inherited. Tutors praised her composure, priests her devotion, and visiting neighbors her beauty. Yet behind the lace and civility lay an intelligence too cold for the parlor. She had an appetite for understanding the world in its most uncomfortable truths, not through faith, but through observation. By 20, she had already outgrown the soft drawing rooms where Southern women were meant to remain. She preferred her father's study, where he kept jars of tobacco specimens, animal bones, and the medical manuals of European physicians. While other young women embroidered, Clarissa copied diagrams of the human form. She could name the bones of the hand before she could waltz. When her father died suddenly of fever, she inherited not just his wealth but his fascination with anatomy, though she pursued it in silence, behind the veil of widow's lace and plantation etiquette. When she married Theodore Duval, a Louisiana sugar heir with a fondness for whiskey and cards, it was not for love. The match was practical, a merger of fortune and land. Her Charleston sophistication made her a prized addition to his world, and his indifference gave her the solitude she desired. The locals called her gracious. Her servants learned that she could punish without raising her voice. Her cruelty, when it came, was deliberate, almost scientific in its restraint. Clarissa had no children, though records suggest she suffered female complications that confined her to the house for long periods. During these absences, she surrounded herself with books, medical treatises from France, agricultural journals from England, and curious pamphlets on phrenology and moral physiology. Her handwriting filled the margins, connecting passages on biology to notes about her own household staff. She wrote of endurance, of resistance, of the ways labor shaped the body. She did not write of suffering. To her, pain was data. Neighbors saw her rarely, except at church, where she knelt in perfect posture, eyes downcast. Her reputation was immaculate. She sent baskets to the parish poor, contributed to missionary funds, and hosted the occasional charity supper for the wives of local planters. They admired her poise, her gentle tone, her precise diction. No one asked why she never dined with her husband. No one questioned why, after certain storms, fires burned in the orchard for days, leaving a metallic smell in the wind. Within her own walls, Clarissa ruled without contest. Overseers feared her more than the weather, and servants learned to read her silence like scripture. A look, a gesture that was all it took. She demanded punctuality, cleanliness, and absolute obedience. Yet she never struck anyone herself. The punishments were always delegated, as though her hands were too refined for such work. But those who returned from her lessons often bore marks that could not be explained by the lash alone. She kept meticulous journals, small bound volumes of calfskin embossed with gold. In them, she recorded everything: the yield of each field, the weight of each worker, the incidence of illness or fainting. She measured not just productivity, but physiology, pulse rates, skin color, the shape of scars. To Clarissa, her plantation was not simply a business. It was a living laboratory. At night, she took solitary walks through the orchard, her lantern swinging like a pendulum. Witnesses said she whispered as she walked not prayers, but recitations, as if repeating notes to herself. The dogs did not bark at her, the birds did not sing when she passed. And in the morning, when the house resumed its perfect rhythm, she would appear at breakfast, pale and serene, a porcelain cup trembling faintly in her hand. Clarissa Duval believed she was advancing knowledge. In her view, the world's cruelty was inevitable. Better to study it, refine it, make it purposeful. In that belief, she found justification for everything that would follow. Theodore Duval was a man born to inherit rather than to build. His father had cleared the first acres of Bellefontaine, his grandfather had expanded them, and Theodore merely presided a figurehead whose presence suggested order, while his disinterest allowed decay. To those who met him briefly, he seemed harmless, tall, polite, with the weary charm of a man accustomed to deference. But behind his languid gestures and easy smiles lay something hollow, a vacancy that the plantation itself seemed to mirror. He married Clarissa in the spring of 1839, a union arranged as much by ledger as by love. The ceremony was small, held in the Duval Chapel beneath a canopy of white magnolias. The guests whispered about the new Mrs. Duval, her beauty, her accent, her fortune, while Theodore stood beside her with the indifference of a man fulfilling a contract. Within months, he was gone for most of the year, traveling between New Orleans and Natchez on what he called business. His letters, few and brief, spoke of riverboats, trade, and the necessary entertainments of men in commerce. Those who knew the truth said Theodore's commerce was gambling. He spent long nights at the Street Charles Hotel tables, his fortune ebbing and flowing with the roll of dice. Rumors of debts trailed him like tobacco smoke, but they never quite reached home. Clarissa ensured that, each time he returned, she restored his dignity with quiet precision, the books balanced, the accounts settled, his name unblemished in the parish ledgers. What she demanded in return was silence. When he was home, the house itself seemed to change temperature. Servants moved slower, more cautiously. Theodore's temper, softened by brandy, could turn without warning. He shouted not out of anger but frustration, as though the air itself resisted him. Yet when Clarissa entered a room, his voice faltered. He deferred to her in every practical matter crop yields, hiring, household management, as though she were the true master. Whether this was fear or relief, no one could say. Neighbors found the arrangement peculiar but not scandalous. Plantation marriages, they said, required balance, one mind for commerce, one for conduct. Still, they noticed how little affection passed between them. They dined at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, their conversation reduced to the exchange of necessities, shipments, weather, illness. Clarissa never interrupted him. Theodore never met her eyes. Their intimacy was not the sort that left bruises or whispers. It was the intimacy of shared isolation. In the years that followed, his absences lengthened. He took a suite in New Orleans, living there for months at a time, while Clarissa managed the estate alone. He wrote to her seldom, though she kept every letter, folding them neatly into her ledgers as if they were part of the accounting. The last of these, dated February of 1851, survives only in fragment. You have your ways, Clarissa. The parish speaks of them, though not to me. Do what you must. I wash my hands of it. And then when word of the orchard discovery reached him later that year, he did not return to Bellefontaine. He sent a message through his attorney, denying knowledge of any indiscretions and insisting that his wife was a woman of singular moral conviction. The plantation, he declared, was her domain entirely. Some said he feared her. Others said he pitied her. A few, those who had shared his cards and his drink, claimed he had once confessed something stranger, that his wife did not sleep, that she wrote through the night with candles that never seemed to burn down, and that her eyes, in certain light, reflected the flame instead of absorbing it. He laughed when he said it, but the laugh did not reach his throat. When the fire consumed Bellefontaine, Theodore Duval was on a steamer bound for Havana. He never returned to Louisiana. never reclaimed the land or the legacy that bore his name. In later years, when asked about his late wife, he would only say, "She knew more about life than any woman ought to." Then he would pour another drink, stare into the glass, and speak of her no more. In the small hours of the morning, when the rest of the plantation slept, Clarissa Duval sat at her mahogany escritoire beneath a single oil lamp. The light fell gently over the surface of the desk, illuminating open volumes of thick cream paper bound in calfskin. To anyone glancing over her shoulder, they would appear to be household account books filled with neat columns of figures, crop yields, and supply inventories. But those who looked closer would have seen something else entirely. The ledgers were not financial, they were anatomical. The handwriting was beautiful, a delicate script that curved with almost maternal patience. Each line was an observation, each entry a record of an experiment disguised as duty. Subject no. 3. Male, age, approximately 30, displays signs of muscular endurance uncommon among peers. Subject no. 9. Female, of mixed ancestry, carries herself with exceptional poise under heat fatigue. To Clarissa, these were not people. They were variables numbered, categorized, and measured for their utility. She referred to them as subjects of observation, an antiseptic phrase that turned humanity into arithmetic. She had developed her own system of classification, a combination of European phrenology, plantation bookkeeping, and her own morbid curiosity. Height, weight, temperament, resistance to illness, reaction to hunger, capacity for pain, all neatly cataloged in rows beside the names she rarely wrote in full. Each ledger began with a dedication written in the same precise hand, for the improvement of man's stewardship over his lesser creation. Clarissa recorded the smallest details, changes in breathing, in skin tone, in appetite, as though documenting a crop's response to rainfall. She compared pure African, Creole, and mulatto bodies with clinical detachment, quoting from French and British treatises on racial constitution. The tone of her writing never wavered. There was no rage, no pleasure, no cruelty she would have recognized as such. Only the calm assurance of a woman certain that what she did served progress. The ledgers also contained sketches, delicate pencil drawings of faces, limbs, and postures. A few showed instruments, clamps, wires, and a peculiar frame she described as the posture apparatus. Margins bore tiny notations in another hand, likely her Charleston mentors, referencing nerve pressure and behavioral alteration. These marginalia were signed only with an initial R. When the parish authorities searched the house years later, they found the ledgers locked inside an iron chest beneath her writing desk. The papers were remarkably preserved, untouched by the fire that consumed the house. The ink had barely faded. Each page was numbered, indexed, and cross-referenced. What they revealed was not simply cruelty but methodology. Clarissa's obsession had grown in precision over time. Early entries concerned work endurance and dietary control. Later ones turned darker experiments in isolation, exposure, and the manipulation of emotion. Subject 27 exhibits rapid obedience when deprived of sleep, one note read. Another, Subject 32, responds to the sound of her own name with visible distress, possible indication of self-recognition to be suppressed. At the bottom of several pages appeared a recurring symbol, a small triangle drawn in black ink, point downward. No investigator could later determine its meaning. It was neither religious nor mathematical. It may have been her signature of success. One ledger, bound in red leather, differed from the rest. It contained only 10 entries, all female, all described as exceptional. The handwriting was more hurried, as though written in excitement. Beside each subject's name was a date, then a single word: integrated. By the time the ledgers were discovered, most of the individuals she recorded had vanished from parish census lists. Their graves, if they existed, were unmarked. To historians, the ledgers are the closest thing to Clarissa Duval's confession, yet they confess nothing. There are no pleas, no acknowledgments of wrong, no hint of conscience. Only perfect penmanship, the quiet cruelty of order, and a belief that her work, her research, might someday be recognized as something other than evil. Those who read them described a peculiar unease that lingered afterward, as if the pages themselves exhaled. Perhaps it was the faint scent of smoke still clinging to the leather, or perhaps it was something else, the quiet echo of a mind that once believed the soul could be charted like a map. Her name was Hester, though on the plantation they called her Old Het. She had been born on the coast of Carolina, sold twice before her 15th year, and brought to Bellefontaine long before Clarissa Duval inherited it. By the time the lady of the house arrived from Charleston, Hester was already known among the enslaved as a healer, midwife, bone setter, and keeper of remedies that white physicians dismissed but secretly sought when their own medicines failed. She carried her knowledge in the lines of her hands and the rhythms of her breath. Clarissa saw value in her immediately. Within a month of her arrival, Hester was summoned from the quarters to serve in the main house. It was an honor few desired. From that day forward, she moved between worlds, the candlelit halls of her mistress and the flickering hearths of her people, bearing messages and silences alike. The servants called her the whispering nurse, for she rarely raised her voice, and yet her words traveled. Hester attended every childbirth on the plantation, both black and white. She cleaned wounds, prepared tonics, and carried the smell of camphor wherever she went. Yet, as the years passed, her duties changed. She was often called to the East Wing, where Clarissa's private rooms lay, rooms no other servant was permitted to enter. Hester would be summoned after midnight, when the house was still. The messenger would find her already awake, waiting, as if she had known the call was coming. What she saw there she never described in full. When questioned years later by a priest who came to record the dying, she spoke of bodies not sick but made so, and of her mistress working with the calm of a surgeon and the smile of a bride. Hester was made to hold basins, to fetch cloths, to administer tonics whose purpose she did not understand. Sometimes Clarissa would speak to her softly while working, asking questions about birth, strength, and endurance. "Do you think the pain makes them better, Hester?" she once asked. Hester did not answer. In the mornings after such nights, she would wash the floor herself before the other servants rose. The scent of spirits, the kind used for cleaning wounds, lingered even after scrubbing. Hester said it was not the smell of death, but of something unnatural trying to live. Once, she found a book left open on the table, a drawing of a human figure marked with lines and notes in Latin. The next night it was gone. She began to notice changes in the household. Some faces disappeared from the fields, others reappeared thinner, quieter, with eyes that refused to meet hers. A young woman named Eliza, barely 17, returned from the house, unable to speak above a whisper. Her shoulders bore strange marks, not lashes, but circles, as if metal had pressed into her flesh. When Hester tried to ask what had been done to her, Eliza only shook her head and murmured, "She said it was for the good of all." Rumors spread that the mistress was ill, that she suffered from fainting spells. But Hester knew better. She had seen Clarissa's eyes after those nights, bright, feverish, as if lit from within. Whatever she was doing in that locked room was not weakening her, it was feeding something. One evening, Clarissa summoned Hester to the cellar to help prepare a subject. The old woman hesitated. Clarissa noticed. "You're trembling," she said. "Are you afraid of me, Hester?" "No, ma'am," the nurse replied. "Only of what you're trying to find." Clarissa studied her for a long moment, then dismissed her with a wave. "Go then. Some people are not meant to witness history." Hester lived another 10 years after the fire that destroyed Bellefontaine. In her final days, she told her granddaughter that the house had burned itself, that the walls remembered what they'd seen and wanted to forget. She died clutching a silver thimble engraved with the Duval crest, a token Clarissa had given her after one of their long nights together. No one knows how Hester came by that thimble again after the fire, but when it was found among her possessions, its inside was blackened not with soot, but with something that had burned from within. By the late 1840s, Bellefontaine no longer resembled a plantation, so much as an institution, one governed by a single, unchallenged will. Clarissa Duval had begun referring to her work as experiments, a word that in her mouth carried neither apology nor hesitation. To her, these acts were not cruelty, they were inquiry. The suffering she caused was not sin, but study. She believed, as she wrote in her private journal, that human difference is the key to creation's order, and the wise may learn by observing the strong endure what the weak cannot. Her experiments began with exhaustion. She ordered select groups of field hands to labor under alternating conditions, one under the sun without shade, the other in partial cover. She measured their pulse, breath, and recovery, often standing in the fields herself, dressed in linen and gloves, taking notes while overseers watched. At first, her subjects were simply recorded. Then they were compared. When one fell ill, she called it failure of adaptation. When one survived, she called it proof of design. Soon she turned to diet. Certain enslaved men and women were fed specific combinations of cornmeal, molasses, or salt pork, while others were denied them. Clarissa tracked changes in energy, mood, and weight. To outsiders, it seemed an eccentric form of plantation management. To those who lived it, it was deprivation disguised as curiosity. One journal entry read, "Subject No. 12 exhibits remarkable composure after 36 hours without sustenance. Spiritual resilience noted, perhaps a physiological trait worth isolating." She then sought to test endurance in other ways. Exposure became her favored method. On cold nights, she ordered select individuals to remain outdoors under supervision, claiming she wished to observe the body's resistance to temperature. A young boy named Abram was one such subject. When he collapsed from frost, she noted the time of his fall and recovery, then sent him back to the quarters without treatment. He survived, though his hands remained twisted with chill scars. Witnesses spoke later of a room she called her study, though it resembled more a workshop. Within it, Clarissa kept instruments no ordinary plantation household required: balances, clamps, glass flasks, and a copper coil apparatus used for distillation. She wrote of her intention to extract the essence of stamina. A note in her ledger recorded, "Experiment 14, testing infusion of herbal stimulant on exhausted subject. Observable result, heightened respiration followed by trembling. Success, partial." Her methods drew from the pseudosciences fashionable among Southern intellectuals of her time: phrenology, humoral theory, and the brutal practice of comparative anatomy. She corresponded privately with European physicians, sending them coded descriptions of her findings and receiving in return suggestions for further improvements. None ever asked from where she sourced her specimens. Clarissa justified her work as moral refinement. "If Providence assigned labor by nature," she once told a visiting preacher, "then to study that nature is to understand God's design." The preacher, unsettled by her calm, never returned. When the War of 1849 brought rumors of slave uprisings to neighboring parishes, Clarissa's methods grew more secretive. She dismissed 2 overseers and took direct control of her subjects. Witnesses recalled faint light from the cellar windows late at night, and the sound of metal striking stone. The following mornings, she appeared at breakfast immaculate, her sleeves spotless, her appetite precise. Not all her experiments ended in death, though many ended in something worse. A woman named Sarah was confined for weeks in isolation to observe psychological adaptation. When she was released, she could no longer remember her own name. Clarissa recorded this as evidence of mind separation. Another, a man called Lewis, was kept bound for so long that the muscles of his shoulders fused in place. She called him a study in endurance achieved. By the spring of 1851, even her servants avoided looking directly at her. Some whispered that she had gone mad. Others said she had merely become herself. Yet, in the stillness of her writing room, Clarissa believed she was close to revelation. Her final entry before the fire read simply, "The body obeys what the mind believes. I have seen the proof. Now I must see if belief itself can be bred. What began as observation had become creation, and in that quiet transformation, Bellefontaine crossed a line it would never return from. At the far end of the east wing, behind a locked cedar door that no servant was permitted to touch, lay what Clarissa Duval called the observation chamber. To others, it was known by a simpler name, the mirror room. It had no windows, only 3 tall mirrors placed at angles against the paneled walls, and a narrow cot at its center. The floor was made of black and white marble squares that shimmered faintly under the constant flame of 4 wall sconces. The air inside carried a faint metallic scent, sharp as old blood. Clarissa spent more time there than in her own bedroom. To the casual observer, it seemed a place for reflection or study, but what she observed was not herself, it was others. She brought her subjects there one at a time, sometimes bound, sometimes trembling, always silent. The mirrors, positioned so that no one could avoid their own image, served as both tool and torment. Clarissa believed that reflection revealed not vanity but obedience. A body that fears its own image, she wrote, has not yet accepted its submission. Records from her ledgers show notations like test of stillness under gaze and measure of nerve under repeated exposure. One entry, dated April 2nd, 1851, reads, Subject 44, displayed violent reaction to mirrored confinement. Self-recognition produced hysteria. Concluded that lower orders resist confrontation with form possible root of rebellion. She wrote it without irony, without pity, as though describing an experiment on livestock. Servants tasked with cleaning the outer hallway said they could hear voices behind the door, Clarissa's low and steady, the others pleading. Yet when the door opened, there was always silence. The air that escaped was colder than it should have been. On one occasion, a housemaid named Ruth fainted while polishing the brass knob. She later claimed she saw movement in the mirrors, though the door was shut tight. At times, Clarissa would enter the mirror room alone and remain there for hours. Through the crack beneath the door, light flickered as though multiple candles danced within, though she brought none with her. When she emerged, her eyes seemed distant, as if she had been somewhere far away. She often went straight to her desk afterward to record what she called the reflections responses. What she meant by that, no one ever learned. Her fascination with mirrors predated the room itself. Letters discovered years later reveal that she had ordered the mirrors from a craftsman in New Orleans, specifying that each must be of the purest silvered glass, polished until it reflects even the faintest motion. She wrote that they were to be instruments of revelation, capable of showing truths that the human eye in solitude cannot bear. The craftsman's apprentice delivered them in the winter of 1849. He was never seen again. One evening, a field hand was brought to the house under the pretense of mending a broken frame. He entered the mirror room at dusk. By dawn, Clarissa called for Hester. The boy lay on the cot, breathing but unresponsive, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Clarissa dismissed it as an experiment interrupted by weakness. The boy was carried out and buried 2 days later, recorded only as property deceased. Those who served in the house began to avoid the east wing altogether. Even in daylight, they whispered that the mirrors whispered back faintly at first, like wind through glass. A carpenter who later dismantled the remnants of the wing after the fire reported something peculiar. The mirrors had fused to the walls, their backing melted and streaked as though from immense heat. Yet, the surfaces themselves remained smooth, unbroken, and still reflected perfectly. No trace of the cot was ever found. Among the surviving ledgers, one final line mentions the room. The experiment has confirmed, it fear leaves an imprint visible only in reflection. The glass remembers what flesh forgets. Whether she meant that as metaphor or discovery, no one could say. But those who entered Bellefontaine after its ruin swore that in the right light, the shards of mirror still showed figures standing behind them, faint, waiting, and impossibly still. In the humid spring of 1850, a letter arrived at Bellefontaine sealed with red wax. and the impression of a serpent wound around a staff, the caduceus of medicine. The handwriting was elegant, European, with the long loops and flourishes of an educated man. The postmark read Charleston. The letter was addressed simply, to Mrs. C. Duval, Bellefontaine Plantation, Louisiana. Its contents would later be cited in depositions, though most of the correspondence was already ash by then. It began, "My dearest pupil, I trust your work continues to progress beyond what the narrow minds of our countrymen can yet appreciate." The author was Dr. Alaric Renaud, once a respected physician in Charleston, later stripped of his license for conducting unauthorized anatomical procedures. Publicly, he had vanished. Privately, he continued his research through protégés, willing to operate beyond the limits of law and conscience. Clarissa Duval had been among his most promising. She had met him at a lecture on comparative anatomy when she was 19, before her marriage, and his ideas had settled in her like seeds waiting for dark soil. The letters that followed were both scholarly and intimate. He wrote to her not as mentor, but as equal. "The work of nature," he said, "is wasted on those who pity it. To understand creation, one must dissect compassion from curiosity." He encouraged her to continue her field studies, advising on methods of preservation, record-keeping, and dissection. One surviving fragment contained a chilling instruction. If the mind can be conditioned through pain, it can likewise be rewritten through repetition. Observe patterns in the subject's breathing during duress. Record the interval of surrender. Clarissa replied in the same tone. Her surviving drafts show no hesitation, no fear of discovery, only eagerness. "The material here is plentiful," she wrote. "They endure more than we imagined possible. The difficulty lies not in obtaining results, but in containing them." The exchange grew more daring with time. Renaud requested samples, locks of hair, fragments of skin preserved in alcohol, and measurements of cranial proportion. Clarissa obliged, sending parcels hidden within shipments of sugar. She referred to her shipments as the produce. He responded with detailed analyses and suggestions for further refinement. Their correspondence blurred the line between science and something more personal. He wrote of her with reverence, calling her the southern spirit of reason and claiming her plantation could become a temple of truth. In the spring of 1851, a final letter arrived. Its tone was anxious, almost urgent. "I have been visited by authorities," Renaud confessed. "They speak of disappearances. My name has surfaced. Burn every trace, my dear. If they find you, they will not see progress, only evil." He signed it not with his name, but a single initial R. Clarissa did not burn it immediately. Instead, she pressed the letter between the pages of one of her ledgers and underlined a single line in pencil. "If they find you, they will not see progress, only evil." Later that year, when the authorities finally did come to Bellefontaine, they found that passage faintly scorched, as if the paper had begun to burn, but lost its courage halfway through. The rest of their correspondence was destroyed in the fire, but fragments survived in ash-stained drawers, enough to reconstruct the strange partnership between a woman on the frontier of science and the man who taught her to believe that empathy was an obstacle. Historians later traced Dr. Renaud's final whereabouts to a boarding house near the Charleston docks. His room was found empty, except for a broken glass jar and a smell of spirits that lingered for weeks. Some said he fled to Europe. Others whispered that the same experiments he taught Clarissa had turned inward, that he had sought to perfect the human frame, beginning with his own. Whatever his fate, his teachings lived on through her. When the fire at Bellefontaine consumed her ledgers and her house, the last surviving letter from Dr. Renaud was found fused to the desk beneath the melted inkstand. The only legible words were those she had underlined herself, a prophecy fulfilled. "They will not see progress, only evil." Between the years of 1848 and 1851, 12 people vanished from Bellefontaine without a trace. No sale records, no bills of transfer, no burials noted in the plantation register. The gaps appeared quietly, like missing teeth in an otherwise perfect smile. To those who lived in the quarters, The absences were neither surprising nor new, only the pattern was. The ones who disappeared were not the old, the sick, or the rebellious. They were the strong, the clever, the ones Clarissa Duval had taken an interest in. It began with a woman named Liddy. She was known for her voice, clear, mournful, carrying across the fields like a hymn. One night she was summoned to the main house to assist in domestic duties. She did not return. Clarissa claimed Liddy had been sent to another plantation as punishment for theft. Weeks later, her name was scratched from the ledgers, and no one dared ask where she'd gone. After that came Jacob, a field hand of unusual height who could lift 2 cane bundles where others managed one. Then Ruth, the housemaid who had fainted by the mirror room door. Then 2 brothers from the sugar mill, taken within the same month. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: a quiet summoning after dusk, the soft creak of carriage wheels on the gravel path. Then silence. In the morning, Clarissa would appear at breakfast as though nothing had happened, her lace gloves spotless, her conversation polite. When the overseer inquired about missing laborers, she would reply with chilling efficiency, "They have been reassigned." The other servants noticed that when she said the word reassigned, she always looked toward the orchard. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, but Hester saw it every time. The nurse told the others never to go near the old oak grove after dark. "That's where she keeps the quiet ones," she said. No one questioned what that meant. Rumors began to reach neighboring estates. Overseers whispered of Clarissa's shrinking workforce despite unchanged production numbers. A merchant who delivered supplies to the plantation noticed that she had begun ordering quicklime in large quantities, too much for sanitation alone. He mentioned it once to a friend at the parish courthouse, but nothing came of it. The Duval name carried weight. The whispers dissolved before they reached official ears. One autumn evening, a storm rolled through the parish, tearing branches from the orchard oaks. When the field hands went to clear the debris, they found patches of earth darker than the rest, heavy, sunken, as though the ground had breathed. They said nothing, only marked the spots in their minds and avoided them thereafter. By the spring of 1851, fear had become a language of its own. Mothers whispered prayers over their children at night, men slept in shifts, and no one volunteered for household duty after sundown. Yet the summons always came, and refusal meant worse. Those who tried to flee were hunted down by dogs and brought back to the main house. Sometimes Clarissa would visit the quarters the next day, smiling faintly, offering biscuits from a silver tray. "You see," she would say, "there's no reason to run." Of the 12 who vanished, only one name ever appeared again in the records: Samuel, a blacksmith's apprentice, who escaped and was captured weeks later near Baton Rouge. When questioned by the magistrate, he spoke haltingly of what he had seen beneath the orchard, of rooms under the earth and walls that sweated blood. His statement was deemed the ramblings of a fugitive and never recorded officially. The court returned him to Bellefontaine, where he disappeared once more, this time forever. Years later, when heavy rains exposed bones near the roots of the old oaks, the parish authorities dismissed them as remnants from the Spanish Wars. But the bones were bound in rusted shackles too small for soldiers. Among them was a fragment of porcelain, curved like the rim of a medical basin. Clarissa herself never acknowledged the missing. To her, they were not gone, they were used. Each one had become a line in her journals, a point of data in her pursuit of improvement. Her plantation ledger for 1851 still showed perfect efficiency, unbroken profit, and no loss of labor. The official record of Bellefontaine contained no scandal, no crime, no mention of the 12. History, like Clarissa, recorded only what it chose to remember, and the rest, the quiet ones, remained buried beneath the orchard, nameless but not forgotten by the soil that covered them. In June of 1851, a man calling himself Samuel appeared before the parish magistrate in Baton Rouge, barefoot, starving, and half-mad from the journey. He claimed to have escaped from Bellefontaine Plantation, from the lady's house, as he called it. The deputies who found him along the riverbank said he was talking to himself, mumbling prayers in 2 languages and clutching a fragment of chain so tightly that it cut his palm. They brought him to the courthouse for questioning, not out of mercy but curiosity. Runaways were common. Runaways who spoke of graves under the orchard were not. The record of his testimony survives only in fragments. The clerk who transcribed it quit his post soon after and left the parish entirely. What remains tells of a night of thunder and firelight, of sounds beneath the ground, and of rooms with no doors. When asked to explain, Samuel said the rooms were made from the earth itself, tunnels dug by those who never came back. He said he'd been taken below once to fetch something for the lady. When pressed on what that was, he faltered. "It weren't no thing," he whispered. "It was someone." The magistrate, a practical man, dismissed much of the account as delusion, yet something in Samuel's voice made him pause. The man spoke in measured phrases, as though reciting from memory. He described the layout of the Duval house with uncanny precision: the east wing, the mirror room, the cellar door sealed with iron. He even recalled the scent of lavender and lye that lingered near the stairwell, the same combination parish inspectors would later note when they visited the ruins. When the magistrate asked what had become of the missing people, Samuel began to tremble. "She keep them in the light," he said. "Not the good kind, the white kind that hurts your eyes. She make them stand still till they stop knowing who they is. Then she say they belong to her twice, once for the work and once for the learning." The courtroom fell silent. The magistrate asked what he meant by learning. Samuel hesitated, then drew his finger across his temple. "She opened them," he said. "She say the head got secrets, same as the heart." The following morning, Samuel was found dead in his cell. The coroner listed the cause as self-inflicted injury, though the manner was never explained. His body was buried in an unmarked grave near the edge of town, the same ground where prisoners were laid. The parish authorities closed the inquiry, noting that no corroborating evidence supported his claims. But one deputy, a man named Lemoyne, kept a copy of the testimony. Years later, he told his son that the escaped man's eyes haunted him not for what they'd seen, but for what they'd refused to forget. "He spoke like a man who'd watched something holy turned inside out," Lemoyne said. "Like he'd seen God's design taken apart and stitched wrong." The newspaper in New Orleans ran a brief story a week later, titled, "Runaway's Madness Leads to Death." It described Samuel as fevered with superstition and dismissed his words as evidence of the moral decay slavery bred in its victims. Clarissa Duval's name did not appear in the article. Still, whispers spread among the parish poor and the riverboat men who heard the story secondhand. They said there were places near Opelousas where the ground never dried after rain, where the earth itself seemed to breathe. Travelers avoided the Plantation road, claiming to hear knocks beneath their carriage wheels at night. Years afterward, when the fire consumed Bellefontaine, those same riverboat men were the first to say it aloud. The witness told the truth. They remembered the man who had escaped with a fragment of chain, a wound in his palm, and a story no one believed until the night the lady's house finally burned, and the ground beneath it gave up its smoke like a confession. The official inquiry into Bellefontaine began in August of 1851, after rumors of the orchard graves reached the parish courthouse. It was not moral outrage that drew the officials, merely curiosity and pressure from the neighboring planters who feared the scandal might taint their own reputations. They sent a small delegation, Sheriff Dupré, Magistrate Chastain, and a parish clerk whose hand shook too badly to keep his ink steady. Their orders were simple: inspect for compliance, confirm or deny allegations of cruelty, and restore order. None of them expected to find anything unusual. The party arrived at Bellefontaine on a bright, airless morning. The fields shimmered with heat, and the smell of crushed cane hung heavy in the air. The mansion stood serene against the haze, white columns gleaming as though newly washed. A dozen enslaved people waited in silence at the edge of the drive, their faces expressionless, their backs straight. When the sheriff approached, one of them quietly pointed toward the house and said, "She already knows you're here." Clarissa met them on the veranda, in full morning dress, black silk, despite the heat, her neck gloved to the chin. She greeted them with perfect courtesy. "Gentlemen," she said, "how unexpected. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Dupré explained their purpose. She listened, nodding as if he were reciting a sermon she already knew by heart. "Of course," she replied. "You will find nothing here that offends the law." She led them through the halls, speaking softly of her late husband's health, her charitable works, and the burdens of plantation life. Every room gleamed with order. The furniture shone, the linens were crisp, and the faint scent of lavender floated through the air. Servants appeared and disappeared with mechanical precision. The magistrate noted the elegance of the house and began to feel foolish for believing the rumors. When they asked about the orchard, Clarissa smiled faintly. "You've been misinformed," she said. "There was once a slave burial ground there, from my grandfather's time. I have since had it cleared and sanctified." The sheriff insisted on seeing it. She hesitated, then agreed. "If it will end this gossip." They followed her down the shaded path, past the well, and the old oaks that leaned like watchmen over the earth. The soil looked freshly turned in places, though the grass had already begun to grow again. "See," she said, "only time and weather." Dupré knelt and sifted the dirt through his fingers. It was damp and faintly gray, as though it had been mixed with ash. He said nothing. Back inside, the men accepted her invitation to tea. The silver was immaculate, the china pale blue with gold trim. She poured with steady hands, though one of the officials noticed faint reddish stains along the lace at her wrist. When he looked again, they were gone. "Gentlemen," she said, "you must understand my household runs on discipline. The talk of cruelty is the work of malcontents and thieves. It is always the ungrateful who slander their betters." Her tone was calm, almost tender. By the time the delegation left, the magistrate had written his report in his head. No irregularities observed. The lady of the house demonstrates excellent management and Christian decorum. Dupré lingered at the carriage, uneasy. "Ma'am," he said, "if I were to return unannounced, would I still find your house so quiet?" Clarissa smiled. "Sheriff, my house is always quiet." That night, she burned half her ledgers and buried the rest beneath the cellar floor. The inquiry's official report was filed 3 days later and sealed without comment. None of the men ever spoke publicly of what they saw, but one the clerk left a note before his death years later. It read only, "The mirrors. There were too many mirrors." The inquiry was deemed closed. Order was restored. And yet, in Street, Landry Parish, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not the silence of peace, but of something breathing just beneath the law, patient and unseen, waiting for the next knock at the door. The first heavy rains of late August came with thunder that rattled the shutters and turned the plantation road to mud. On the third night of the storm, the ground beneath the orchard gave way a slow, sinking collapse that swallowed part of the slope and exposed the brick foundation of something buried deep beneath. At dawn, field hands were sent to inspect the damage. They found a stair of red clay bricks descending into darkness. The entrance had been sealed with timbers, now split open by water and rot. When the news reached the house, Clarissa Duval did not rise from her breakfast table. She listened in silence, sipped her coffee, and said only, "Cover it, quickly." But the overseer, curious and emboldened by rumors, disobeyed. He gathered 2 men and descended before the mud could reclaim the opening. What they found below would never appear in the parish records. It was not a root cellar, nor storage for wine or sugar. It was a chamber narrow, stone-walled, damp with the smell of salt and lye. Rusted chains hung from iron rings, driven into the brick. The floor was littered with shattered glass, bone fragments, and the remains of porcelain basins. Against one wall stood a wooden table, scarred by cuts and burn marks. The men fled before they could look further. Clarissa arrived within the hour, wrapped in her black shawl despite the heat, her face unreadable. She dismissed the overseer and his men with quiet authority, then descended the stairs alone. Witnesses saw her lantern glow through the cracks in the boards for nearly an hour before she emerged, covered in dust, her expression strangely serene. "Seal it again," she said. "This is an old family vault. There is nothing down there you should not already know." But something in her voice, too calm, too deliberate, betrayed her. That afternoon, the field hands refused to work the orchard, claiming they heard voices when the wind passed through the trees. The overseer threatened them with punishment, yet he too avoided the place at dusk. The ground, they said, gave off heat like breath. Later, when parish authorities finally came to investigate the disappearances, Clarissa led them down the same path, pretending ignorance when they pointed to the collapsed hill. "A storage cellar, unused for years," she said. But by then, the entrance had been cleared and re-bricked. She handed them the keys herself, knowing the door would not open, the locks fused by rust and lime. Still, the sheriff struck the wall with his boot, and a hollow sound echoed through the ground. It did not sound empty. What they found inside days later, after the fire, was pieced together from reports, fragments, and the testimony of those who dared look. Beneath the main house ran a network of tunnels connecting to the orchard vault. Within them were small alcoves, each barely large enough to stand in, their walls blackened by soot. Shackles were bolted to the stone at intervals. In one alcove lay a pile of bones, ribs, and vertebrae, charred but unmistakably human. Among the debris, investigators found items that did not belong to a plantation: a copper distillation coil, a leather-bound notebook, half-burned but legible, and a brass instrument resembling a surgical clamp. The notebook's surviving page contained a single sentence written in Clarissa's hand: "Endurance must be perfected in darkness, for only there does the body reveal its truth." After the cellar's discovery, laborers refused to remain on the property. By night, the orchard seemed to whisper, and from the broken vault came a smell not of decay but of alcohol and iron, as though the place itself were preserving what it could not forget. When the rains came again, the soil collapsed a second time, burying what remained. No one tried to uncover it again. They said the earth had decided to keep its secret. Even now, when plows turn up strange shards in that ground glass clouded by soot, rusted rings, porcelain smoothed by time, the locals say it's best not to touch them. "That's Bellefontaine's memory," they whisper, "and she remembers too well." When the parish men combed through the ruins after the fire, they found a leather-bound book half buried in ash near what had been the cellar entrance. The cover was cracked, the edges blackened, but the pages within had survived dry, brittle, and stained with something dark that was not ink. Inside, the handwriting shifted between two distinct styles, one tight and elegant, belonging unmistakably to Clarissa Duval, the other broad, slanted, and unmistakably masculine. The first page bore a title: Observations in Applied Human Physiology, Volume 3. The masculine hand was later identified as belonging to Dr. Alaric Renaud of Charleston, the disgraced physician whose letters had guided Clarissa's descent into her experiments. The early entries were written in his voice, clinical and methodical. Subject A demonstrates endurance, disproportionate to nutritional intake, pulse steady under deprivation, suggest repetition with alternate diet. The tone was detached, confident, as though the writer were describing livestock. Then, midway through, the handwriting changed, Clarissa's, now overtaking his, her penmanship calm and deliberate. She began annotating his observations, correcting his errors, arguing with his conclusions. "Dr. R misinterprets the purpose of suffering," she wrote. "Pain is not an accident of the flesh. It is a function. It reveals the measure of spirit." Over time, her annotations grew longer than the original text, until she was writing entire sections herself, her words steady and eerily devotional. The journal chronicled dozens of experiments carried out over 3 years. Clarissa detailed methods of stimulus endurance, controlled starvation, and nerve reaction under fear. Some entries described transfusions of vitality, attempts to take blood from one person and infuse it into tincture, another, One note mentioned using animal organs as substitutes for the weaker tissue. Another, dated late in the year 1850, stated, "Subject 31 expired during procedure. Tissue response promising." The last sentence on that page read, "Light must be increased next time." The most chilling entry was not a description, but a confession. Clarissa wrote that Dr. Renaud had visited Bellefontaine in person during the winter of 1849. She recorded his stay in almost worshipful detail, his lectures on anatomy, his fascination with her laboratory, and his conviction that the human mind can be purified through its own destruction. Then, abruptly, her tone shifted. "He grew careless," she wrote. "His curiosity exceeded his endurance. The process took him as it has taken the others." Below that, a line appeared in his own hand, trembling and erratic. "The subject has become the observer." After that entry, his writing ceased entirely. Only Clarissa's remained. Her later notes spoke of continuing his great work, of refining what he began, of merging endurance with submission to reason. The entries became increasingly frenzied yet precise, filled with diagrams of human figures marked by circles and numbers. Near the end, the writing became almost illegible, the words sprawling across the margins. "He is still speaking beneath the floor. I have learned his language." The parish coroner who examined the journal later swore under oath that one page, though burned around the edges, remained warm to the touch even hours after he handled it. The ink shimmered faintly, as if freshly written. The final line, dated only August, read, "When the body ceases, the memory remains. Flesh may perish, but knowledge does not die. It transforms." The coroner sealed the journal in a canvas satchel and sent it to Baton Rouge as evidence. It never arrived. Somewhere between Street Landry Parish and the courthouse archives, the satchel vanished. No one signed for it. No trace of it was ever recovered. Local lore insists the missing book was never lost, that Clarissa herself came for it. They say that on certain storm nights, when the wind passes through the broken orchard, a faint rustling can be heard, as of paper turning by unseen hands, and the soft, steady voice of a woman reading aloud, cataloging the living and the dead alike, as if the experiment had never truly ended. On the evening of September 3rd, 1851, a column of black smoke rose above the cane fields of Street Landry Parish. By dawn, Bellefontaine was gone, the great house reduced to embers, its white columns charred into skeletal silhouettes. The fire began shortly after midnight. Witnesses from neighboring plantations reported seeing the first glow near the east wing, spreading too quickly, too evenly, for accident or lightning. The night had been clear. There was no storm. The servants who survived later gave conflicting accounts. Some said they were awakened by the sound of the piano soft notes, played slowly, as though a child were practicing. Others said they saw Clarissa herself standing on the veranda, her black dress moving like smoke, holding a lantern in one hand and a small leather book in the other. "She wasn't afraid," one woman recalled. "She looked calm, like it was something she'd already seen." Within minutes, the house was an inferno. Those who ran to help found the front doors locked from the inside. Windows exploded outward from the heat, scattering shards across the veranda. The orchard trees caught next, their leaves curling into black hands that clutched at the sky. The overseer, shouting orders, tried to break through the cellar entrance, but the bricks glowed red, as if from a furnace beneath. No one who entered the house returned. The parish alarm bell rang through the night. By morning, all that remained were smoldering walls and the warped outline of the iron gates. Clarissa Duval's body was never found. Of the 12 who had vanished before the fire, none were recovered either. The official death toll recorded only 3 servants and 1 overseer, presumed perished. But the smell that hung over the orchard for days afterward, heavy, chemical, and sweet, told another story. When the sheriff arrived the next day, he found strange patterns in the ash, circles of unburned wood beneath where the mirrors had once stood. A staircase collapsed inward, leading to a pit of fused glass and iron. In the wreckage of Clarissa's study, he found melted instruments, half of a brass clamp, and what appeared to be the charred remains of books, their spines curled like sleeping creatures. One page survived, fused to the desk by heat. The ink was half gone, but 3 words were legible. She chose fire. Some believed the fire was deliberate, Clarissa's final act of purification. Others whispered that it was judgment. Hester, the old nurse, who had escaped to the quarters before the blaze, claimed she heard voices in the smoke. Not screams, she said, prayers. All saying the same thing: let it end. The flames burned for 2 full days. When the rains finally came, the water hissed upon the ruins like a benediction. But even the rain could not wash away the smell of spirits and ash. Those who sifted through the debris said the ground beneath the cellar was black glass, as though the earth itself had melted. Weeks later, parish officials recorded the incident as an accident caused by chemical compounds used for cleaning. No mention was made of the cellar, nor of the bones found in its corners. The insurance claim was denied on the grounds of moral negligence. Theodore Duval, still in Havana, sent word that his wife's possessions were to be destroyed. Yet the fire did not erase everything. The orchard survived, blackened but standing. In the seasons that followed, new shoots rose from the scorched roots, pale and thin as bone. Locals said the trees grew faster than before, though their fruit came late and tasted faintly of metal. Children dared each other to touch the soil where the house once stood. They said the ground was still warm, even in winter. To this day, no one knows whether Clarissa Duval perished in the fire or walked away from it. Her name faded from parish records within a decade, her lineage unclaimed, her land left to weeds. But when storms gather over the bayou and lightning flashes across the horizon, travelers swear they see a figure on the hill, a woman in black, lantern raised high, watching the orchard burn again and again, as if ensuring that the experiment never ends. When the flames finally died and the smoke cleared, what remained of Bellefontaine was little more than scorched ruin and rumor. The parish authorities arrived 3 days late, not because of distance, but hesitation. Everyone had heard the stories by then, how the fire had burned without wind, how the earth had glowed from beneath, how no one heard screams, only a strange humming that carried across the fields. The official report called it a domestic accident resulting in total loss of property. But the people of Street Landry Parish whispered something different, that the house had burned itself. The survivors, those few who had escaped the blaze, were gathered and questioned. They spoke cautiously, as if the very air of the plantation might still be listening. One woman said she'd seen Clarissa walking calmly through the orchard moments before the fire, her hair loose, her eyes bright like someone seeing heaven. Another claimed the mistress had poured a line of spirits from the veranda to the cellar steps, then struck a match without looking back. The overseer's wife swore she heard singing, not one voice, but many rising from beneath the house as it burned. No 2 accounts matched exactly, yet each circled the same truth. Clarissa Duval had not been trapped by the fire. She had invited it. In the days that followed, the enslaved who remained were sold to neighboring estates. They were marched away in groups, chains clinking softly in the morning heat. Most went willingly. A few looked back only once toward the blackened hill where the house had stood. Hester, the old nurse, refused to leave. She stayed in a makeshift shack near the well, saying she was watching the ground. She told anyone who asked that the earth was still moving, breathing, and that if it was left alone, it might finally sleep. The parish tried to bury the story. The Duval name still carried influence, and the surviving family in New Orleans paid generously to silence further inquiry. The sheriff who had led the inspection resigned. The magistrate left the state altogether. The clerk, the same man who had once described the mirrors, was found drowned in the bayou before the month was out. His notes were recovered from his coat pocket, still legible despite the water. The orchard was alive. The ground hummed underfoot. The plantation's land was sold at auction the following spring. A sugar broker from Baton Rouge bought it for a fraction of its worth, intending to rebuild. But when his laborers arrived, they found the soil too soft for foundations, tools bent, animals refused to approach the orchard. By midsummer, the broker abandoned the venture, claiming, "The place won't stay quiet." He left behind his equipment, and within a year, the weeds reclaimed it all. Of Clarissa Duval, no trace was ever found, no bones, no jewelry, not even the rings she always wore. Some believed she perished in the flames, consumed by her own creation. Others swore she fled through the river marshes, taking with her a single surviving ledger and vanishing into the Gulf under another name. There were whispers that she'd been seen in Havana, living as a widow of French descent, her hands still gloved, her voice soft and precise. But those who went searching for her found nothing. In the years that followed, Bellefontaine became a wound in the landscape, one that refused to heal. Travelers along the Bayou Road said they could still see a light on the hill at night, flickering faintly, like a lamp swinging behind a shuttered window. The locals called it the Lady's Lantern. They said that when it appeared, the air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic, sharp, and unforgettable. No church was ever built on the site. No plows broke its soil. The weeds grew tall, the orchard leaned inward, and the roots beneath continued to shift. On quiet nights, the people of Street Landry still tell their children not to wander near the old Duval land. They say the fire never truly went out. It simply moved underground, where it waits, and that if you stand long enough on that hill, you'll hear it, the faint rustle of paper turning in the dirt, and a woman's voice whispering as she writes. The experiment continues. The auction took place the following spring, under a sun so merciless that even the flies moved slowly. The ruins of Bellefontaine still smoked faintly beneath the weeds, the air around it thick with the smell of burnt sugar and lye. Yet the parish officials stood in their best coats, wiping their brows, pretending this was business as usual. Another sale, another estate changing hands. The crowd was small, a few planters from neighboring parishes, a cotton broker from Baton Rouge, and several agents from New Orleans sent to bid on behalf of anonymous investors. They arrived by carriage, their wheels creaking through mud that still steamed when the morning light struck it. No one mentioned the fire, no one mentioned the missing mistress. They spoke instead of losses, liquidation, and opportunity. The clerk read the list in a voice too loud for the silence. 26 acres of cane, the remains of one main house, and assorted holdings. When he came to the final line, his voice faltered. Item 14, various medical apparatus, iron fixtures, and glass vessels recovered from the cellar. The words hung in the air like flies over a carcass. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a man in a gray suit cleared his throat and offered $10 for the lot, sight unseen. No one raised the bid. The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the sheriff, who simply nodded. The hammer fell with a hollow sound. What the buyers took away that day was more than property. The wagons carried not only iron and glass, but evidence. Inside, crates marked agricultural equipment were brass clamps, curved scalpels, and flasks that still smelled of spirits. Some were etched with numbers. Others contained blackened residue that refused to wash away. There were also ledgers half burned, their ink blurred but still legible in places. One page listed names beside strange notations. R3, exposure successful. S9, failed at 4:12. The broker who handled the sale later admitted he'd thrown those books into the bayou that same night. "I didn't want them following me home," he said. The remaining goods, furniture, rugs, a cracked piano, were purchased by a widow from Lafayette who hoped to furnish her boarding house. When her cart overturned on the road, breaking one of the mirrors from the east wing, she claimed she heard voices inside the glass, faint, rhythmic, as though someone were breathing behind it. She refused to touch it again and left the rest of her load at the roadside. By morning, the piano had burned where it lay. The auctioneer, a man named Reeves, wrote afterward in his logbook that the day felt unwholesome. He noted how the wind died each time a bid was placed, how the crows circled but never landed. By the end of the afternoon, even the officials were eager to leave. The sheriff locked the gates for the final time, handing the key to the highest bidder, a sugar trader from Baton Rouge named Thomas Keene. Keene was confident, practical, and skeptical of superstition. He announced plans to rebuild at once. Within a month, he hired laborers to clear the land. They lasted 2 weeks. Tools broke without cause. Lanterns went out even in calm weather. One night, a worker digging near the old cellar unearthed something round and glassy, a jar sealed in wax, its contents unrecognizable. The next day he left without collecting his pay. By harvest season, Keene had abandoned the property entirely, leaving behind his equipment and a single written note: "The ground hums. I will not fight it." The parish records list the estate as sold once more the following year, this time to a consortium of northern investors who never visited the land. After that, the trail ends. The remaining items from the auction vanished, scattered across attics and barns, lost to fire or decay. Yet now and then, something reappears. A mirror, a basin, a fragment of a brass instrument sold at estate sales, with no provenance. Each carries the same faint odor of smoke and alcohol, and each, sooner or later, is broken by accident or fire. In Street Landry Parish, they still say that the Bellefontaine auction was cursed, not because of what it sold, but because of what it tried to measure: the price of cruelty, the weight of silence, the worth of the human soul reduced to salvage. And they say that the ledger of the bidders, the one that recorded every name and sum, was found years later in a courthouse drawer, all the ink washed pale, except for one line written at the bottom in a different hand. The experiment is closed. It was in the spring of 1868, nearly 17 years after the fire, that a northern journalist named Elias Turner came to Louisiana. The war was over, Reconstruction had begun, and stories from the Old South, especially its secrets, were currency. Turner worked for a Boston paper, known for its exposés on moral reform and medical malpractice. When he heard whispers of an aristocratic lady who had conducted scientific cruelties upon the enslaved, he took the first riverboat south. He was a tall man with a limp from Gettysburg and a fondness for detail that bordered on obsession. Turner believed truth had a smell: ink, mildew, and candle smoke, and he hunted it wherever it lingered. Bellefontaine, by then, was a legend. The locals refused to name it. They called it simply the Burned Hill. They warned him that the land was cursed, that the trees there grew too fast, that the air around them was thick with whispering. He dismissed it as superstition. Yet when he arrived and saw the orchard for himself, crooked trunks bent as though under invisible weight, he admitted later in his diary that he felt the peculiar stillness of a church after the dead have left. Turner began his investigation in the parish archives. Most of the records had been destroyed during the war, but a few documents remained. The insurance claim denied for moral negligence, the incomplete inventory from the auction, and an unsigned statement from a deputy who had witnessed the cellar excavation. The deputy's note mentioned chains fused to brick and instruments of unchristian design. It ended with a sentence Turner underlined 3 times: "She learned too much." From there, Turner sought out anyone old enough to remember the Duvals. He found them scattered: former overseers, neighboring farmers, and one aging seamstress who had once sewn gowns for Clarissa herself. Each spoke of her with the same mixture of fear and awe. "She wasn't cruel like most," the seamstress said. "She didn't shout. She didn't whip. She just watched, like we were pages in a book only she could read." Turner's final lead came from a tavern in Opelousas, where an old man claimed to be a cousin of the Duval line. His name was Henry Duval, the last living relative. He was thin, pale, and reeked of gin, but his memory was sharp. He confirmed that Clarissa had corresponded with a Charleston physician, a man who talked about the soul like it was clay, and that after the fire, family members were ordered never to speak her name again. "She left," Henry said, took one of the smaller ledgers with her. "I heard she went south, Cuba, maybe. They say she never aged. Folks saw her 20 years later, looking the same as before. Same voice, same eyes. Said she smiled too easily for someone alone." Turner pressed him for proof, but Henry only laughed. "You think a ghost carries papers?" he said. "If she's still walking this earth, it's because she found what she was looking for." The journalist returned to the hill that evening, determined to find evidence. He camped among the ruins, taking notes by lantern light. In his final entry, dated May 21st, he wrote, "The soil moves when I sit still. The air smells of spirits and salt. I heard a sound under me tonight, a slow knocking, like metal against stone. I thought it thunder, but the sky was clear." He was never seen again. Weeks later, his horse was found wandering near the bayou, its saddle still carrying Turner's satchel. Inside were damp papers, his field notes, sketches of the orchard, and a draft headline for the story he never sent to print. "The Lady of Plantation, Science Without Mercy." A footnote was written beneath it in his own hand, faint and smudged, as though written in haste. "I think she's still here." By the autumn of 1881, Plantation had been rebuilt not as a mansion, but as a modest manor raised by a northern sugar merchant named William Harrington. He had purchased the land at auction for next to nothing, convinced that superstition was merely ignorance and that the past could be tamed with reason. The orchard was cleared, the old cellar sealed with lime, and new foundations laid where the house once burned. Within months, a pale wooden house stood where Clarissa's had fallen, smaller, cleaner, utterly ordinary. But the ground beneath it had not forgotten. At first, the family heard only sounds, small things, the tapping of pipes that weren't there, the faint ring of glass from the floorboards below. Mrs. Harrington, newly arrived from Ohio, complained that the cellar air smelled of medicine, though no one had ever stored a bottle there. Servants refused to enter it after dusk. They said the walls were warm, even when the night was cold. Then came the voices, faint, rhythmic, rising through the cracks in the floor, not whispers, but something closer to breath. The eldest son, barely 10, swore that when he pressed his ear to the planks, he heard someone counting. The housekeeper, trying to soothe him, knelt to listen herself and paled. "It's the same number, over and over," she said. 31. She keeps saying 31. The number meant nothing to them, but years later, historians would recall that Clarissa Duval's final ledger, the one recovered half-burned from the ruins, ended with an entry labeled Subject 31. By winter, the servants began to leave. One woman found her mirror fogged each morning, with words traced in the condensation, shapes like handwriting, always wiped away before anyone else could see. The housekeeper lasted longest. On her final night, she woke screaming that she'd seen a woman standing at the foot of her bed, dressed in black, her hands red to the wrist, smiling like a hostess. The Harringtons tried prayer, then science. They brought in a doctor from Baton Rouge to test for miasma in the air. His instruments found nothing, but when he descended into the sealed cellar, he returned ashen, refusing to explain. He left his tools behind and boarded the next riverboat north. The house grew quieter after that, unnaturally so. Doors no longer creaked, floors made no sound, and even the insects seemed to avoid its shadow. One night, Mrs. Harrington awoke to the scent of lavender and saw a faint glow under the door of her husband's study. Inside, she found him sitting rigid in his chair, staring into a glass jar on the desk. The jar was half full of clear liquid, and within it floated what looked like a curled fragment of flesh. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. He did not answer. By spring, they left the house abandoned, taking only what fit in their carriage. The locals refused to move in, and so it stood empty again, shutters drawn, surrounded by the whispering orchard that no longer bore fruit. Children dared one another to peer through its windows. Some swore they saw candlelight flickering inside, though the doors were chained. When a surveyor visited the property in 1902, he noted that the new foundation had sunk nearly a foot since its construction. "The ground beneath," he wrote, "feels hollow, as if it breathes." His final sketch of the site showed faint outlines below the surface, shapes resembling tunnels leading toward the orchard. By then, the story of Plantation had become a regional legend, part ghost tale, part cautionary fable. But for those who still lived within earshot of the burned hill, it was not legend at all. They said the lady had come back not as a ghost, but as memory made flesh, still searching for her lost subjects, still listening for their breath beneath the soil. And on nights when the fog rolled down from the bayou and the air smelled faintly of spirits and lavender, travelers along the parish road claimed they could see a lantern swaying through the orchard. Sometimes it vanished between the trees, sometimes it turned toward them, and when it did, the light was never gold. It was white, the cold, merciless white of a laboratory flame. In the winter of 1932, a young historian working for the Works Progress Administration arrived in Street Landry Parish. His name was Daniel Price, a thin, studious man from Chicago who had been assigned to catalog antebellum records for the State Archive. His task was simple: collect parish documents, record oral histories, and file everything by date and condition. He had no interest in ghost stories or plantation legends. But that changed the day he opened a wooden crate labeled Bellefontaine, Miscellaneous. The crate had sat untouched for decades in a courthouse storeroom, its edges soft with mildew. Inside lay a disorderly stack of letters, brittle receipts, and half-burned journals bound with string. The topmost envelope bore the Duval seal, a faint, cracked crest that dissolved under his thumb. The first page he unfolded began, "Experiment must begin anew under controlled conditions. The previous fire taught valuable lessons." It was written in a woman's hand, steady and elegant. At first, Price assumed it was a forgery or a piece of fiction, but as he read further, the handwriting shifted, the paper darkened, and the tone became unmistakably scientific. One document, dated 1851, listed subjects of endurance with coded initials beside each name. Another described methods of extraction and temperament correction. Tucked between them was a scrap of parchment, edges scorched, bearing a single phrase in faded ink: "Endurance perfected becomes silence." Price worked through the night, transcribing what he could. By dawn, his fingertips were black with soot. He found letters from Charleston postmarked with the name Dr. A. Renault, confirming the correspondence historians had long debated. Another note, unsigned, referred to Specimen 31 and transfer of notes to Havana. The realization struck him slowly. These were Clarissa Duval's private papers, presumed destroyed in the fire. He requested permission to move the crate to Baton Rouge for preservation, but his supervisor refused, citing lack of funds. "Photograph what matters," the man said, "and leave the rest." So Price stayed in Street Landry, copying the most legible pages by hand. Weeks turned into months. The courthouse janitor later recalled that Price began muttering to himself while he worked, repeating the same phrases he read. "The flesh remembers, the body obeys." In March, Price wrote his wife a letter. "I think she was trying to rewrite creation itself. These aren't records of madness, they're blueprints." And she succeeded, at least in part. "I've seen drawings, figures standing, breathing, though labeled expired." That was his last letter. 2 days later, the parish clerk found the archivist's workspace empty. His typewriter still held a half-finished line: "Knowledge survives fire." The crate of documents was gone. No one saw Price again. Months afterward, a farmer plowing near the old orchard unearthed fragments of paper fused to metal office staples twisted by heat. The handwriting was identical to Price's. It described observation of respiration in altered soil. The paper crumbled at the touch. The WPA report eventually filed in his name contained only one paragraph about Bellefontaine. It read, "No significant materials remain. Site deemed of minor historical value. Local superstitions persist, but lack verifiable origin." Yet in the Baton Rouge archive today, tucked between boxes of unrelated ledgers, there exists a single unmarked folder. Inside is a photograph, taken in poor light, showing the first page of one of Clarissa's recovered letters. The words are faint but legible. "If they burn me again, I shall rise through the ones who read me. The ink will breathe." Archivists who have handled the photo report a peculiar smell of alcohol and lavender that lingers on their gloves for hours. None can explain why the image, though printed in black and white, seems to shimmer faintly when viewed in the dark. Today, the land where Plantation once stood is little more than an overgrown field, a low rise covered in wild grass, and the broken skeletons of oaks that refuse to die. The road leading to it has no sign, only a rusted gate half buried in vines. Travelers rarely notice it. Those who do seldom stop. The locals call it the Still Place, though no one can say who first gave it that name. They avoid it instinctively, as if the air itself remembers too much. The foundations of the house remain beneath the soil, warped bricks pressed together by time and heat. After storms, the ground shifts, and small objects work their way upward, bits of glass, rusted chains, a porcelain shard that gleams white against the mud. Farmers who once tried to plow the land said the earth resisted the blade. "It's like the ground pulls back," one man told a newspaper reporter in 1953, "like it don't want to be opened." In the years since, Plantation has become both legend and warning. Writers have speculated, historians have denied, and locals have quietly insisted that some truths are better left unverified. The name Clarissa Duval appears in no official Louisiana record after 1851, no burial certificate, no probate file, no surviving kin. Yet her handwriting persists, identical signatures found on letters and medical notes across 3 continents, dated decades apart. Havana, Buenos Aires, even London, each signed always CD. Some call it coincidence. Others think she survived the fire, that she took her knowledge and her cruelty abroad, continuing her research under new names. Theories abound. A Cuban asylum destroyed by unexplained fire in 1854. A series of South American medical reports referring to behavioral reconstruction, none proven. Yet the pattern, the same precise phrasing, the same fascination with endurance repeats, echoing like a refrain. Closer to home, the stories never stopped. In the parish, they say the orchard still breathes. Hunters passing through at dusk have heard the sound of glass shifting beneath the soil. One claimed to see a lantern swaying between the trees, white and cold, moving against the wind. Another, a child in 1961, wandered too close to the ruins and returned whispering numbers under her breath, 31, over and over, until her mother slapped her silent. A film crew once came to document the site in the 1970s. Their equipment malfunctioned. The footage they recovered showed only fragments, static, flickering light, and a figure at the edge of the orchard, motionless and pale, watching from the dark. They abandoned the project. The film was never released. Today, the land is privately owned but uninhabited. The deed changes hands every few years, a silent cycle of investors who never stay long. Surveyors who visit the site report magnetic irregularities, as though something beneath the surface hums faintly. They describe the same scent the parishmen once noted, a mix of alcohol, salt, and lavender. In Baton Rouge, the recovered photograph from the archives still sits in its folder. Some say the image changes with time, that new words appear faintly along the edge of the page, as if Clarissa continues writing from wherever she went. The archivists have locked it away, citing chemical degradation. But those who have seen it swear the ink glows faintly under lamplight, forming a line that was not there before. The body perishes, the work does not. If you stand on the hill today, the air is unnaturally still. The birds do not sing, the trees do not move, only the sound of the river in the distance, slow and heavy. And sometimes, when the wind shifts through the cane, you can almost hear pages turning soft, deliberate, endless. The people of Street Landry Parish no longer speak her name aloud. Yet, every generation, someone new returns, a student, a scholar, a stranger chasing the same shadow, and the ground gives up one more piece of her story. And when it does, the silence deepens, as though the earth itself listens. Because whatever she began in 1851 never truly ended. It simply went underground.